Alright guys, welcome to the very first video on a brand new channel that is all about working with these old antique tools. Now this hand plane right here is a Stanley Baily number 7, and this is the plane that started it all for me. Now as you can see, it's in pretty rough shape. I bought this at a flea market for $40 Canadian, I should say, so that is a fairly good deal on a plane like this. And it's kind of funny to be starting this whole journey of working with these antique tools and just kind of restoring them that with such a large plane, because there's a lot of tricky stuff that comes into working with something that this size. Now the funniest part about this is I didn't plan to find anything when I went to the flea market. This was my first time actually going to a flea market, and I just had very low expectations. My hope was to get some screwdrivers that I could rehandle. I never could have expected to find a Stanley Baily number 7 there. And honestly, this one, even though it looks like it's pretty rough, it is in decent condition. You know, there's a lot of body rust, but overall, all the parts are there. The tote and the knob, they're not broken, and it was actually kind of surprising how good this thing was. So for 40 bucks, it seemed like a no-brainer. Now, when I brought this thing home, I was a giddy little child. I was so excited to finally have this cool antique plane, and I just wanted to jump into it. And that's basically what I did here. So I hopped onto YouTube and on Google and just found as many different articles in that talking about how to restore these old planes, and I just tried to follow the best process I could find. So I went through, tore everything down, started by scrubbing it down with just some normal soap and water to take off all that old oil and grime. And then now what we're going through and doing is putting it in this rust-eating bath. So basically you just leave the plane and all the other parts in this solution, and it just eats away the rust. And this stuff is completely magical. I don't quite understand how it works, but it just basically eats most of the rust off the surface. Now again, I feel like it's important to mention that this is my first time dealing with one of these old hand planes. The only other hand plane I've ever used is my Veritas low-angle jack, which is a great hand plane, but these older ones, they have a certain charm to them. And so I've actually, as I'm launching this new channel, I'm re-recording this video and just kind of going through and doing it again, because I wanted to make sure I did it right. I wanted to make sure I got the right information out and all that. So what you're going to be seeing in this video is quite a bit different than the processes you're going to see in a lot of the other videos that I'm going to be doing here. But overall, this was the foundations for everything that I learned. So again, with the tote and knob here, all we're doing is just going and cleaning them up with some sandpaper, trying to take off that old varnish, and then going through and putting some wax on them. Now, I do plan to go through and redo this number 7 at some point in time, because like I said, this was the first one I've done, and it wasn't great. There's stuff that I would definitely redo, especially the tote and knob. I didn't sand them down enough to get through that old lacquer varnish that's on there. So I would like to get all the way through that and just give a little bit of a nicer feel. But everything else in this plane actually came together really nicely. And the whole process of kind of figuring out this plane, breaking it down, just gave me such an appreciation for these old tools. And I think the other important part to mention about this plane is that it's actually kind of special to me, because it's a made in Canada Stanley, which is fairly rare. Even though now I've actually been doing this, you know, collecting these planes and that for a few months, I haven't seen a whole lot of made in Canada stuff. And my goal someday is to have a whole collection of made in Canada antique Stanley planes to use in the shop. So that's my goal, but it's proven very challenging to find these Canadian made Stanleys. So this one was super cool, and I was able to date this one to about the 1950s pretty accurately. So it's not a super old antique Stanley, but it's old enough, you know, it's well older than I am, so that's pretty dang cool as it is. So then with the body out of that rusting solution, we can go through and start the flattening process. Now this is the most challenging thing with a number 7 here, is going through and making sure you flatten it properly, because if the sole of the plane isn't flat, it's really not going to do you any good. And so I took it very slow. That red paper you're seeing on the far side there, that was 180 that I started with. Now I'm stepping down to 120 because I realized that there was a lot of work I had to do. And so I'm just slowly applying pressure over the length of the body here and just slowly eating away at material. I'm not forcing it down, I'm just kind of letting the weight of the body ride across the sandpaper. Now, there's a lot of different advice you'll find online about when and how you should do the flattening on your plane. Some people say you should do it like I'm doing it here. Some people say you should always do it with the plane fully assembled, and most people say you should do it both ways. So with the number 7 here, because I knew I was going to have to remove a decent amount of material, I started by doing it with the whole plane unassembled like this. And I just got through and got everything down to as raw metal as I possibly could. Now on the sole of this plane, there are still some rust pockets, or there's some there's areas where the rust ate away at the actual surface, and unless I went through and fully sanded through basically the entire sole of this thing, I probably will never get through there. But the other thing, then I got this really good advice from one of my buddies, is that you don't need a perfectly flat sole. You want it as flat as possibly can be over the length, but the sole doesn't need to be perfectly flat. You can have those little pit marks in that, and it's not really going to affect things. As long as there's a flat spot on either side of that pit mark, you're gonna be just fine. So on smaller planes like a number 5 or a number 4, it's very easy to go through and stand out any of those pit marks in that. But on something like a number 7, you want to do as good a job as you can, but you don't want to take off so much material that you make this thing super weak and brittle. So when I started with this plane, I knew that I wasn't going to be making a work of art. That's not my plan. Even now, after doing a bunch of collecting, actually building up a decent collection of hand planes, I still don't ever plan on collecting these things. My goal is just purely to get them to a nice, good, functional stage and to hopefully prevent rust. But the one thing I did find very interesting that I tried on this plane was going and buying this little throwaway sandblasting gun. So this one was on sale for 12 bucks at Canadian Tire, so I figured why the heck not? And I just went through and it worked. The idea worked, and this is what eventually convinced me to buy the sandblasting cabinet that I now have, but it did not work well enough. You can see here that we're just barely removing any material across the whole body of this thing, and it just proved to not work very well. The other thing I tried on the body was using some paint stripper, and that same thing, I didn't have good results with that. I most likely used it wrong, but it's one of those things where I just really couldn't find a good solution to it. And again, that's why I eventually went and bought a small sandblasting cabinet. But at this point, I just kind of gave up and was happy with the amount of paint I'd been able to remove, put it back in the rust solutions to get rid of all the stuff that had formed while I was working on it. Then again, while it was resting in there for a few hours, I could go through and work on the rest of the parts. So the blade here, it was in actually pretty good shape. It wasn't super out of flat, anything like that, but I started by just doing a light flattening on both sides of the blade, just trying to get it to sit as flat on the frog as I possibly could. Now, one of the things I'm still considering with this plane is going and getting a really nice Veritas PMV11 replacement blade. And the thing that I found with these blades is that they hold a good edge, but they definitely are nothing compared to my Veritas blades that are in my low angle jack. So it's one of those things where these old blades, they are good, they do hold an edge, definitely. You can get them nice and sharp, but I do think that someday, if I do keep this plane around for a long time, I may end up going out and buying one of those Veritas replacement blades because, it'd be really nice to have that kind of razor sharp edge sometimes. But again, not super necessary for a plane like this that is just meant to be long for edge jointing that, but it's still one of those things where I'm considering it. So now this is going to be the part where we get some annoyed people because all I'm going to be using on here is just some normal rattle can spray paint. Now, sadly, this is before I kind of realized that I could get kind of fancy with the paint jobs, and so it's just going to be nice and simple. I went to the hardware store, picked up I think it's a semi-gloss black spray paint, and I just went through and masked all the areas I didn't want to get paint on and then just sprayed it down. So the problem with this, in my opinion, is that it just goes on a little bit too thick. Now, it doesn't actually look bad. Like, even when I look at the plane now, I hesitate to go through and refinish it because there's really not that much point. There's more chance of screwing something up, but it's also a case of I know the process pretty well now. So if you don't have like the airbrush setup and that I use now, then a rattle can is a perfectly good option. Again, the whole thing you got to do here that's very important is just putting on very light coats and make sure you're taking the time to mask off the areas that you don't want to get paint on. Then we can go through and with that painted coat on there, we can start working on the frog. Now, this is one of the things that I found the most interesting when I was doing my research into this, is that flattening the frog is really what takes one of these planes from being kind of a generic hand plane to being a really good functional one. Because there's this kind of idea that these old Stanleys are some of the best hand planes that existed in the world, right? They're some of the best tools you can possibly get. And the harsh reality of it is that I've found anyway, is that it's not that they're great, it's just that you can make them great for a really good price. Again, I paid 40 bucks for this number 7. If we compare that to the Veritas or the Lee Nielsen number 7 equivalent, those ones are upwards of $500. So yes, this plane is good for the price that I paid for it, for the work that I put into it. This is a really good plane. Does it compare in quality in that to a Lee Nielsen? Never, but it's one of those things is for me, I also don't use a number 7 nearly enough to really justify going out and buying a Lee Nielsen or a Veritas. But in this case, having this number 7 has been an absolute game changer in the shop. My number 1 use for this plane is actually flattening my workbench. Now that I have this plane, every month or so, I'll go through and just kind of touch up the areas of my workbench because I have a pretty cheap pine workbench. it goes out of flat quite often. So I love using this plane to go through and just touch up those areas. Just make sure that my bench is as flat as I need it to be. So as we put the final plane together here, I just want to thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and you feel like I deserve it, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more of these tool restorations, because I've got a lot more coming down the pipeline here. I've got a whole cabinet behind me in my office here that is just filled with old tools that I'm looking forward to restoring. But anyway, here are our final steps of just going through and flattening it. So now that we have the whole plane assembled, we can go through and do that final flattening layer. And then really importantly, I learned is to go through and bevel your edges, because it's very easy to break or chip an edge on this old cast iron. So as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.